Welcome to Agility Awakenings podcast, where I interact with great thought leaders, explore the holistic view of agility, and finding ways to understand the system's dynamics better. Today, we are talking about TameFlow and systems thinking with Steve Tandon, MD TameFlow Consulting Limited, author, consultant, and advisor on organizational performance and emerging technologies. Steve is the creator of the TameFlow approach, a management approach that helps businesses focus on the fewest things that make the greatest impact on people, performance, and profit in collaborative knowledge work without compromising sustainability, quality, or humanity. Steve holds a MSc in Lean and Agile Software Project Management with the University of Aberdeen. It's time to get some deeper insights from our wonderful guest. Hello, Steve. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Balan. It's wonderful to be here with you and your audience.
Thank you so much for accepting the invite. And I'm so much delighted to have you here. And I'm a big fan of your TameFlow approach and, of course, the theory of constraints. So could you just tell more about TameFlow and what kind of approach we are using there?
Well, that is a simple question, and the answer is both simple and multifaceted. But since you mentioned the theory constraints, I like to highlight the deep simplicity that is behind TameFlow. And the problem, so to say, is that it's counterintuitive. So you would not sense that there is simplicity. If I just describe what TameFlow is and what we do, you would say the opposite. Oh no, it doesn't work. It's complex, complicated. It's doesn't work with us. All sorts of objections. And I often draw the parallel of the egg of Columbus. You might know the story of how Columbus convinced the queen to finance his exploration adventures by challenging these knowledge scientists to make an egg stand up. Now there are many variations on the story, but the point is that once he reveals how to do it, it is that classical reaction of slap of your forearm. Oh yes, why did I not think about this? It's so obvious. It's so simple. And TameFlow has a bit of that trait that once you've seen the solution, once you've seen how it works, it is simple. But it's not simple to let's say, put in the picture in perspective, because you need to go through this mental development. That's why I say TameFlow is based on mental models. Mental models, which we all have. And what is the most important effect of the mental model? Well, it's driving your decisions. You have an understanding of how the world works, and you're facing problems every day. We have problems, never-ending flow of problems, and we need to make decisions to confront these problems. And then those decisions turn out into behaviors, how we relate with other people, how we manage the inevitable, the inevitable diversity of viewpoints, the conflicts that emerge when we relate to other people. So mental models are really powerful and important. And the essence of TameFlow is, let's figure out if there are other mental models than those that we are used to. And maybe they will give us the same aha moment. And from that moment on, we will make different decisions. That's how TameFlow works. And when you start making these different decisions, you will make the company, the organization, better in many ways. TameFlow is named like that because we work with 4 flows: the financial, operational, informational, and psychological flow. So you start making these different decisions, and you will see improvements in all these 4 dimensions. And I think that's quite quite unique because many of the other approaches or schools of thought in this space maybe focus primarily on one aspect rather than another. Most of Agile is focusing on what happens at the team level, and then they have to face the problem: how does this scale? How does it apply to other parts of the organization? Uh, Other aspects might be driven by finance. That comes typically from the big name consultancy companies like EY, McKinsey, and so on. But they seem always to be detached from what happens on the ground. So we have all these different vectors or directions with which the problem space of how to better manage a company are confronted. And I would claim that TameFlow, in its simplicity, covers all these dimensions. So I don't want to keep on talking here. You must be given a chance to ask me some questions.
Yeah, of course, I love to do that. And you mentioned there are four flows: operational flow, knowledge flow, psychological flow, and information flow. Right. So, could you just tell about the story behind the TAME flow? How you just come up with this framework, or maybe the approach, so that it will bring more focus towards solving the problems?
Well, the story is quite long, and before I converged like on the idea of flow and flows in plural, there was a long period of I would almost say of incubation, which started off early in my career when I was at Borland International, and long story short, that company inspired Jim Coplin to start off let's say, the domain of organizational patterns, in particular for software development. So it's this idea of the pattern movement that inspired many of the very early agile or even pre-agile approaches is a core component of how I have been thinking. That is really the origin of TameFlow. It is a pattern language, if you wish. And in this trajectory where I was trying to use patterns to improve, first, let's say, my own work, second, the work of my teams, and then as my responsibility grew, the scope of action became like the business units and even business in their entirety, because I managed mergers and acquisitions. Well, this pattern thinking kept on evolving and evolving. And at a certain point, it came across the theory of constraints. I came across the theory of constraints. It was with David Anderson's first book, Software Engineering Management, with the theory of constraints. So I don't remember the title exactly. It was like 2003, 2004. And for me, that was a wonderful discovery. I didn't know about TOC at that point. So it was a great discovery. I devoured all sources I could find on TOC. And maybe the point here is, why was it so important? Well, because one of the key patterns I was working with from the early starts with Coplin's work was the pattern of the unity of purpose, and a related one, which is the community of trust. And that is like common traits of all high-performing teams and even high-performing organizations. They have a unilateral focus on one thing, and they all stand behind that. Conflicts are resolved rapidly. There is convergence. They are all on the same page, all rowing in the same direction. And there is a lot of, let's say, collective flow. Things happen because people think in the same way, so they don't need to communicate and coordinate. And you see this typically in high-performing sports teams, where some teams just seem to have a mind of their own, and they are sensing the entirety of the playfield in a very shared and common way. So that is the characteristics of high-performing teams and organizations, the unity of purpose. So back to TOC. Why was TOC so important? Well, because it gives us one focal point, which is the constraint of the theory of constraint. And with one focal point, it becomes like a catalyst. It's so easy to bring the minds of all people to focus on that point and build the unity of purpose from that focusing. Now, this is a very important aspect. Why? Because when you hear a phrase like, oh, we want to have the unity of purpose, it's often like aspiration. So it's a big, nice thing that you put on the wall at the entry of the company. We are, our values, our mission, we have the unity of purpose. Very nice. But often doesn't go beyond the aspiration. Now, with the constraint, you can apply the thinking of the theory of constraints augmented with the patterns, and you can cause the unity of purpose to come into being. This is very powerful because you can cause a company to become a super performing company. And that's something that has struck me. Then the story is that David Anderson, a few years after, came up with the Kanban method. Why? Well, because he had concluded that you can not apply the theory of constraints to knowledge work. And for me, it was a huge moment of disappointment because Herbie, as you know, Herbie is our colloquial term to identify the constraint, to name the constraint. At that point, Herbie had been buried. He was no longer with us. And no, this is not possible because then I lose this catalyst to be able to produce the unity of purpose. So I set out to figure out how can we think in terms of the theory of constraint and find Herbie in this knowledge work setting. Because if I'm able to find Herbie, then all this wonderful mechanism of causing the unity of purpose comes back and I would be happy again. So that set me off for a long journey. And I think that at the end, I more or less like resolved this problem, how to find Herbie in collaborative knowledge.
That's a really engaging story. And you mentioned like mental models and this unity of purpose. So every organization is a complex adaptive system and there are many players with their own interest. So how can we build a shared mental model?
Well, and let's say TameFlow has these 4 flows. So I don't want to give like the classical consultant's answer. It depends, but in a way it does. Why? Because these 4 flows are typically the concern of certain categories of professionals. Now, one for all, the CFO is concerned about finance. So if you are going to speak to the CFO, you will have to start with a certain kind of conversation with certain kind of topics. Likewise, if you talk to someone who is, I don't know, manager of the HR department, the topics must be different. So why do we have these different topics depending on who is listening? Because you mentioned something in your question that is very relevant. The interest of people. The interest of people, the what is in it for me? Why do I come to work every morning? What is the driver? Yes, you need a salary because you need to put food on the table and a roof over your head and clothes and everything. So that is certainly a very important component. But there must be more behind it. So why are you there? And this like highlights the philosophy that I eventually have developed at TameFlow and was very much inspired by understanding the other aspects of TOC, which just to clarify, TOC has like, broadly speaking, 2 large bodies of knowledge. One is finding the constraints of the 5 focusing steps. And the other one is the logical thinking processes, which starts with the evaporating cloud. We'll get back to that in a moment. So what was the thinking here? Yes, the interest of people. So that's what we learn from TOC, that we can resolve the conflicts that exist between different people. And that goes to the core of how we make this happen, because we always start with the deep needs of each and every person, every single individual in the company. The deep needs of the CEO, the most important person in the company, at least from a legal perspective, to the latest junior hire that just came in yesterday and doesn't know where the rooms are in the building. So we start with the need of these people. And what does this bring us? Well, often when there are conflicts in the company, it is not because there is a problem, but because my perspective on what is happening is different from your perspective. Why? Because I have my mental models and they are supporting my needs, like you have your mental models with your needs. So if we can start with the premise that, okay, we are working the same company, so obviously we must be working towards the same goal. If we have that as a consolidation point, then our respective needs can be subordinated to that common goal. And often, with the technique of the evaporating cloud that I mentioned before, it's a structured way to see how our perspectives, how we think our perspective, our individual perspective is contributing to the goal. And of course, is there to serve my needs. But maybe my needs are in conflict with yours. So we work with this and we expose the underlying assumptions. Why am I thinking like this? And this brings forward the mental model. Now, why is your thinking like that? And the beauty of this is that because we are aiming at one and the same goal, we can question these assumptions. And we try to invent new assumptions. In the TOC language, they are called injections. And you try to replace your old assumptions with new ones. So a new mental model, basically. You're bringing in a new mental model into the picture. And what is the purpose of this? Well, it is to preserve your need, but changing the way that need is served through the operations in the company. And that brings us to a new situation. So it's brings in innovation. The injection is an innovation. It comes from a mental model, a way of thinking whereby both our respective needs are met, and at the same time we converge towards that common shared goal, and we are creating that unity. Now I know this sounds very, very abstract when I explain it in these terms, but it's very concrete. Because whenever we are in a company and we have a concrete problem to face, we can use this technique. And as you see, I used the word injection, but I also said it's an act of innovation, because that's how you bring in new ideas into the company. So the conflicts that we have are very, very positive. They are an engine of innovation, provided you can frame them in this way of thinking. Now, there was also another thing that you mentioned that is worthwhile expanding on. You mentioned complex adaptive systems. And you know that I have this metaphor of the Jeep, the journey, and the
Really a great metaphor.
Yes. So of course, no, the perception that we are overwhelmed with complexity is correct. Now that's you cannot negate that. And also we cannot negate that there are complex systems and that there are complex adaptive systems out there. Society as a whole, the complex adaptive system. But the point that I'm making, and that is also one of the key elements of Goldblatt's thinking, is that within the, let's say, the social body that is a company that is going in one direction, a lot of the perceived complexity is not real. It's self-inflicted. How does this happen? Well, for instance, as the company grows and things appear to become more complex, management, in lack of better mental models, want to have more details, more information, more data. So they create all these nice departments and silos. They start making different KPIs for one and for the other. And all of these people in the respective branches of the organizations are working to support their KPIs. And often those KPIs are in conflict with
Mm.
one another. There are many examples of this. And so the conflict, of course, creates confusion, creates complexity, but it's never addressed. So this is why I say this is self-inflicted complexity. It's not real complexity. And just as you created it, you can make it
Mm.
literally evaporate. That's the sense of the name of that technique, the evaporating cloud. You have a dark cloud above you, but if you do the right flipping in your mental models, it can evaporate. It's just not there. It was a creation of your mind, not of nature. Mind you, I want to be very clear about this. I do not negate that complexity exists out in nature. There are complex adaptive systems. But most of the companies and most of the complexity you have in companies is really self-inflicted. And if you remove them, you will do so often by that focusing of your thinking, and you find that single point that changes everything. That is the inherent complexity of Goldra. Once you see that, it's the aha moment. Oh yes, why did I not think about that? It's so simple. Stupid me. Why did I not think about that? No, and from that moment onwards, you will see these patterns over and over again, and you will, at least that was my experience. You will try to help others to see the same simplicity in the complexity.
Wow, that is brilliant. I really love the evaporating cloud technique, which externalizes the underlying assumptions of our conflicts and helps in building the shared mental model. You also mentioned pattern thinking. Could you just share your insights about pattern thinking and how it nurtures the systems thinking?
Well, that's a really great question because patterns are really really broad, and I uh, I will be right specific here, saying that the patterns that I work with are what are known as Alexandrian patterns. So the thinker behind them was the architect Christopher Alexander, and there is a huge body of knowledge about that. Now we can get to the patterns in many ways, but one of the simplest is to think about one pattern as a solution to a problem in a context. Well, three things: a solution to a problem in a context, and that's how you like describe a pattern. But when you work with pattern, the order is maybe the opposite. You have the context, and in that context, you have many problems, and each and single problem can have many solutions. So it's a multiplicity. You know, you start thinking and exploring of all possible ways um, to confront the situation. Once you pick a specific triplet, so that context with that problem and that specific solution, you can say, okay, that triplet is a pattern. Now notice this is like descriptive. We are describing the context, we are describing the problem, we are describing the solution. What happens if you decide, so the mental model, you make a decision, you decide to apply exactly that solution to that problem, to that context. This is the interesting part, because by doing so, the original context changes. Of
Yeah.
course, there was a problem. Now we have a solution. The problem is no longer there. So the context has changed. And then you have this iterative process. Okay, now in this new context, over again, what are the problems? What are the solutions for every single problem, and so on? So there is some parallel with many of the different improvement loops that we have out there, like PDCA, PDSA, the 5 focusing steps. Now, this idea of iterating is quite core to the pattern thing. But what is the power of patterns? And this is how TameFlow was developed. Well, patterns can be used in primarily in 2 ways. One is to uh, you go into a situation and you describe it. So it's a diagnosis, like a doctor. You feel bad, you go to the doctor and you say, "No, I'm bad, my back, my my eyes are not seeing, and you might think there is one cause, but the doctor has a much deeper understanding and tell you that there is another cause. So you can use patterns to describe a situation. And this is where the pattern language aspect starts to merge. It's the passive use of the pattern language. In this company, we have this, and that problem, and these, and those solutions were used. They didn't resolve the problems; they are still there, but you can describe what you're seeing. The second use of the pattern language is more like actionable, where you say, okay, in this context with that problem, you tried that solution, but it didn't work. We know that there is another solution because we've seen it over and over again in many other places. Try this one. So it becomes prescriptive. It's almost like I hate the word. It's almost like a recipe. But you see what happens here, that you have a context and you find the problem, you apply a solution, and then you have a new context. So you can describe that transition, and that becomes like a verb that's saying, in this context, we have a problem, that is the solution. And that triplet becomes like an expression of language. And in the new context that you derive, you can apply that again and again. And by concatenating all these patterns, you are describing a much deeper transition. So that is how the pattern language can be used to describe complex, multifaceted, multi-step, multidimensional transformations. Now, what is the power of this? Now, why was I so deep into patterns? Well, because as I was evolving my ideas, and especially when I got to that point that I had lost Herbie and I wanted to find Herbie again, patterns become very powerful to do like comparative studies of different approaches. So you can say, this is Scrum. Scrum has a whole set of patterns. And by the way, as you know, Scrum has been described in terms by patterns. There's a whole group doing this. You say, this is Kanban. There are other patterns, and so on and so forth. So you can decompose the different schools of thoughts into constituent patterns. And then you start to have having these ideas. Well, what if in this situation, I use the pattern that comes from that other school and combine? What will happen? And then there's the third school, the fourth school. And then there is, crazy people having crazy ideas, but we capture them as well. And this allows you to have like a merge of all these ideas, and you try them on the field. Say, well, yeah, this worked. Let's document it as a more trustworthy, reliable pattern. In the pattern description, there is also this dimension of the confidence level of how good is the pattern. So you might combine things and you discover, yeah, they are working. So it's a new pattern that you can add to your pattern language, or the opposite. You know, this doesn't work, or you discover that pattern that is typical in that situation really has a lot of weaknesses that can be overcome by this other pattern that comes from another language, pattern language, or school of thought. That's what I want to say. And you see, by doing all these recombinations, at the end, you are evolving your own system. And that is like the genesis of TameFlow, how it evolved. Now, there are many who want to use patterns as cookie cutters. We have this problem. Let's apply this solution. And while that is possible, I think it's a very elementary use of the idea of the pattern. The pattern language has really its power when you're doing these comparative studies and trying to figure out what are the elements from one or the other lines of thought that really bring you the most value, and how can you combine and recombine them. When I was writing my first blog, you can still read it on my website, TameFlow.com/blog. I called it the chronologist, because I was keeping like the chronology of my thinking, or how it evolved. And I also had the picture of it was a horrible face of a medieval drawing, And I said, no, this is like an alchemist that takes bits and pieces and tries to find the magic formula to create gold. And that's what I was saying. I'm trying to be like that alchemist that takes bits and pieces from many schools of thoughts and create gold. What is gold? Well, it's happy, high performing people.
Dear listeners, be good at sensing the patterns and become an alchemist like Steve for building a high performing team. Great. Steve, could you just share some tricks to find the patterns that would work for some situations?
No, there are no tricks. It's really very, going back to thinking uh, in agile terms. It's very empirical.
Mm,
One of the ways to see patterns is that uh, there is that inner loop of um, improvement loop, which, unlike most other improvement loops, allows, if you want to use a database term, allows a rollback in the sense that you have this structured way of thinking and organizing the things you see in the organization. It's okay. Over here, there is something that we don't like, and that's the context, and maybe that is the specific problem we don't like. And we have many solutions. Now, every problem can be confronted in many ways. We have many solutions. I'll give you an example shortly. We have many solutions that we might want to consider. Now, which one do we pick? Well, maybe there are some theories that will allow you to pick one or the other, but if you don't know, the best thing is try them. It becomes empirical.
mm,
You try it, and maybe it doesn't work. What do? Okay, we discard that solution. We roll back to the problem. The problem is not resolved. We try another one. So it is very, very explorative, very iterative, very empirical. And that's something that often when you hear people talking about patterns, it completely lost because they think patterns is a huge catalog, an enormous menu, like you get like in those fast foods, menus that never end, and at the end you don't know what to choose because it's so vast. So that is the wrong thinking of patterns. It's not a menu that you pick from. It's a systematic way of improving and of documenting that improvement. And of course, as I mentioned before, the great value is that you can do this within one company and another and another. So you develop a language that spans different realities. And that gives you the comparative power of saying, okay, in this context, this company is a
mm.
small startup. These patterns work. This other company is a medium-sized company. It's starting to bring in professional management. These other patterns work. This is the mega corporation with 10,000 people and hundreds of teams. Another set of patterns applies. You see, there is no idea of scaling things. Everything is very contextual and changes as the context changes. Now, I said I would give you an example. The one example that I always cite to explain this is we know now from several years of development in this field that limiting the working process is a key thing. Of course, if you have less things on the table, it's easier to focus. So we want to limit the working process. How can you do this? What are the solutions? Well, Scrum, for instance, uses sprinting. The idea of interrupting every 14 days or so to reload the sprint backlog in reality is a WIP limiting tool. Many don't think about it in those terms. It's more about the inspection and adaptation of the end of the sprint that is brought forward as a value. Of course, it is valuable, but one of the key elements of success of Scrum is that it introduced a technique to limit the working process with sprinting. Okay. Then you have Kanban. What do? They have the columns in their Kanban boards and they put the WIP limits on top of Kanban. That is another way of limiting the working process. Then you had the first instances of TameFlow where I used a con-WIP system to say, no, there is not a limit on every column, but across the board, across the team, there is an upper limit that you must not pass. And then you have the TOC way of doing this, which is the current way that I use in TameFlow. It is with the drum buffer rope scheduling system. I won't go into the details, but you see what we've done. Now we highlighted that the idea of limiting WIP is very valuable. We should try to implement it. And I just listed 4 different solutions. Which one works? Which one doesn't? Well, try out in your context and see. Don't take it for granted that because you have read somewhere that one is better than the other, that it really is so. Believe your own context, your own reality, so to say. Be, how can we say, dare to explore. Try one, try the other, and measure. Now, measurement, I am also a strong proponent of metrics. So measurement is really important because it takes away a big source of conflicts, which are, my opinion, is more important than yours. It always happens in companies. But if you have measures, metrics, especially metrics that are, let's say, hard to manipulate and to gain, you get more objectivity, less conflicts.
Yeah, limiting WIP brings more focus to what is there on our table. And it also gives us space for us to experiment and find the right patterns applicable to the context. But one thing I really loved when you mentioned that measurement is really important because it takes away a big source of conflicts. That's a wonderful way of seeing the metrics. So, if you want to suggest few metrics, Steve, what would they be?
Well, since I talk about the 4 flows, I would say that you need at least 4 metrics
Hmm.
to represent the scope of concern that I have in TameFlow. So let's start with the financial flow. Here I introduced the notion of financial throughput, which is what in TOC is called throughput. The term is overloaded because in Kanban throughput means something else. So I specify this is the financial throughput. And you measure that simply by how much money the company is making per unit of time. So money over time. Since you're dividing by time, there is like a sense of speed. If you make more money per unit of time as a company, you're probably better off than if you're making less. Conversely, on the operational side, while we do have operational throughput, which we define in terms of Little's law as a working process over the, well, most of the industry would say cycle time, but I say flow time. There is a fine distinction to be made. So while we could use operational throughput, I would say, the only metric that I would care that you measure is the flow time, also known as cycle time, as I said. I don't know if you want to go into the distinction there, but basically it's the time from the start to the end of a piece of work with a distinction to be made. So that's the only measure I care about in the operation. For the informational flow, well, we need to look at the feedback loops that typically go from lower levels to higher levels in the organizational hierarchy. What typically happens is that the higher up you go, the longer the feedback loops are, and they spin once every quarter. They're very, very slow. While if you're at the bottom and you are doing, I don't know, extreme programming, your microcycle is measured in tens of seconds. So you have a huge span of frequencies of these feedback loops. So what we want to measure is how frequently are we communicating upwards, and we want that frequency to be very high. So we want to communicate more, but also we need to look at the load of information that is being transferred. So we want to communicate less information, but more frequently. In a way, we want to limit the working process of top management. What does top management work with? Decisions. And if you give them a pack of information every 3 months that they need to make a decision on, well, they are overloaded and they will make wrong decisions, and they will make decisions on information that goes stale very quickly. Conversely, if we reduce the batch size of the load of information and give it more frequently, the effect is that management feels that they have the steering wheel in their hand. And rather than navigating like a transatlantic container vessel where you turn the rudder and after 5 miles it starts to turn, you feel more like a Ferrari. You just nudge the steering wheel and off it goes directly in the new direction. So we want that to happen with flow of information. The information must come to the decision point and come back as quickly as possible. And then for the psychological flow, well, basically we try to measure the happiness of people. Are they in mental flow states? Can we help them to be in mental flow states? So avoid the interruptions, avoid the excessive meetings. We all hate meetings. Most of them are completely useless. They are just filling the calendar. So we want meetings that are very focused and bring out decisions rather than commitments to something in the future. So decision-making meetings. And we also work with the literal, let's say, definition of psychological flow, which comes from the late American-Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I think I pronounced that more or less badly, where he was saying that the flow state is achieved when you are right at the limit of your abilities, of your skills, and you can still make it. So you have to be stressed, but not too much. Now, I have ways to work with operational flow so that the load of the team is in that so-called flow zone where the team can work as one of those wonderful sports teams we mentioned earlier. So you see that things are connected, like the operational flow is determining if the teams are in a good psychological state. That determines how good they are communicating. That establishes how well flow of, let's say, things to be done go through the company, and that eventually establishes the flow of finance. In short, no, the numbers we are using are very, very few, unlike most other systems where you have KPIs for all sorts of things. And for a team that is starting, I think the single most important thing to measure is flow time.
Dancing with the flow. Nice. I think all these metrics are deeply interconnected and give us the holistic view of the system's goal and how to achieve that goal. But one of the major challenges in every organization is about scaling. So, how the TameFlow approach helps to navigate the scaling challenge?
It's not helpful at all, because I say scaling is exactly one of those false problems that has been self-inflicted. And if you change the perspective, you won't have that problem. How can this be done? Well, this is where the mental models of TameFlow maybe need to be explored in more detail. But I just give you one example, which comes from the re-elaboration of what happens in critical change project management. When you have multiple teams, you might also know that I am fond of saying we deal with a pest environment. It's not ugly to say so, but it gives the sense that you don't want to be there. What is the pest environment? It's a place where you have a multitude of projects or products or streams, value streams. You have a multitude of events, deadlines, one after the other, overlapping, conflicting deadlines. You have a multitude of stakeholders. Everyone wants their stuff to be done before anyone else's. And you have a multitude of teams. So it seems like exactly the situation where you want to have a scaling solution. And what are the scaling solutions? Well, you take something that worked for a small team and you scale it up. And you get the scaled agile framework, which in most places becomes a huge exercise of training thousands of people in how these processes work, the cadences, the meetings, the PI plannings, and all of that. And agility is sought through compliance to these rules. which is the exact opposite of being agile. So what do we do? Okay, let's step back to that critical change project management technique that gives you this idea of the buffer burn rate. You need to manage the work in process. Most project management approaches don't. They just focus on the timeline. They forget there is work to be done as well. And you try to limit that. And then you monitor in real time how much of that work you're doing with respect to a very specific dimension. That is your past flow time performance, the flow time distribution. That can give you a signal when things go not as you wish. There is some oncoming problem, gives you time to react very early. So there are many positives, but what is the relationship with the scaling problem? This mechanism, which you compute by dividing two percentages, is scaleless because dividing two percentages gives you a number. So what does it mean? You can apply this metric to the performance of a tiny team with a small project, as well as the performance of the execution of a portfolio of projects with tens or hundreds of teams. It's the same thing. You can compare what normally would be seen as apples and oranges, but you can compare them because you look in this new dimension that you would not consider before. Again, the mental model, the shift of perspective. And once you have these tools that allow you to have a cohesive understanding of where the problem is, where the Herbie is, okay, you know where to focus. Is it the large portfolio project or is it the tiny team? Well, you have to look into these signals and you get an indication of which one is the critical one, and you go in and act there. And this brings me also to this idea of I mentioned slightly before of the jungle, the jeep, and the journey. Many of the approaches that you see in trying to address the issue of scale, for instance, value stream mapping, take a very, a very static view on what is happening. You try to map out what are the cues. And my friend Al Shalloway says you have to remove the delays, which in principle is all correct and nice. But if you're not addressing the constraint, that will be vain. So what is the idea of the jungle, the jeep, and the journey? Well, it's to bring in the notion that you have a certain capacity, which is your jeep. You have plenty of jeeps, many teams, the best environment. Every jeep has its own capacity. But then you have to go through the jungle, or you have an idea, you have to go from A to B. Those are the projects, your roadmaps, the future looking. You have that trajectory to traverse. Notice that trajectory is determined by the incoming work. So what your customers are asking, it can be completely different from one month to the other, especially in large organizations. And once you are working on that chunk of work, your jeeps are traversing the jungle. That is the journey. That's where you have Mr. Murphy. That's where bad things happen, and you have to react and fix them. So this simple idea of the jungle, the jeep, and the journey is by nature scaleless, because you can apply this way of thinking in the micro as well as in the macro. And there are many other aspects of TameFlow that bring these mental models where you have a single way of looking, no matter if it is a tiny team or a huge organization. And what is the power of that? That you can use the same mental model to make decisions at all levels. So you don't need to train people in compliance exercises to certain cadences and producing certain artifacts. No, you need to train them on making decisions in a coherent and consistent way, so that the decision that the JavaScript developer makes today are consistent with the decisions that the CEO makes for a strategic purpose. It's that consistency of decision-making criteria that creates the unity of purpose. And because it's across the board, by definition, there is nothing to scale. it is already covering the whole scale that you want. But I will stop you.
Is really amazing because the people are really struggling with the scaling and a lot of investment on training and upskilling. But I guess the building this mental model is the crux for so that the players or maybe the components within the system, they can sense that belongingness with the system to see the bigger picture and taking the coherent decisions, right? So that it will be helpful for them to travel together and achieve the goal. And I feel like TameFlow is really not beating around the bush up to the point and focusing on what is needed, what are the things to be focused so that we can tame the flow of work and achieve more value.
You on that one, Balan. So TameFlow is not beating around the bush, but that's to be.
It's really like a focus, bring that focus and achieve the thing. And that's the main, because this world is a very distracted world and we are just drowned in the data. And any single thought, anything you want to share with community about systems thinking, how we can nurture that, maybe just from your experience.
Maybe if we reconnect to what we said at the beginning about the personal and individual needs, your own self best interest, I would say, even if it sounds maybe not so nice, but I would say no, TameFlow gives you a license to be egotistical, to think about yourself, to think about what is best for you. Why? Because if you think about what is best for you in this context of the system, of the system's thinking, you will discover that you will make choices that will make you happy, but they will also make everyone else happy as well. But you need the right mental models. So there we have the input from TameFlow. Dare to think about yourself and make sure you are open to consider the needs of all others. Because if we consider the needs of everyone, then we can find that unity of purpose. Systems thinking is just an overarching idea that for me is like a practical way to cause this unity of purpose. But in this unity of purpose, my needs have to be totally satisfied and your needs as well. We have to take care of each and everyone. When I tell this famous story of Herbie, I always say, we never leave Herbie alone in the woods and we all share the load. So that is the sense of this.
Wow, great. I think this unity of purpose and a win-win situation for everyone so that people can just work together and they can just feel the being with the wholeness or maybe being with the system. That gives a lot of power to them and give more energy to achieve the goal. So it's really amazing.
It's this point that is like the one of those aha moments that if we agree that your needs are important and my needs are important as well, and we respect each other's needs, then we can reason about why there is the conflict. But if we don't see, if I fear that my needs will be like ignored or overridden, then of course I won't participate in the conversations that are necessary to resolve these conflicts. So it's really important to get this. And this relates also to psychological safety. This is how you produce, how you create, how you cause psychological safety, is to help everyone to feel confident that what they intimately need is going to be considered. In short, you are important, just as important as anyone else. And when you start developing that perspective, then you don't fear the conflict because you know that we have this way of thinking that the conflict is really an engine of innovation. What does the conflict mean? It means that you have a perspective that is different from mine. You know something that I don't know and vice versa. So there is lack of wholeness of understanding, and the conflict allows you to broaden your horizon. And in that broadening, we will take care of your need and my need, and we will both live happily thereafter.
Constructive conflicts are good, and they are the sunshine of innovation. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us and sharing your profound insights about TameFlow approach.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and thank you so much. And of course, any new books or any courses you are working on, Steve?
The one thing that I would like the audience and the listeners to know about is the TameFlow community, the circle.
Mm.
Because that's where anyone interested in TameFlow can join in the conversations and be part of the, I would say, the making of TameFlow, because TameFlow, being based on patterns, is never standing still. Every year I add new things. I take away some happens. I also take away things. So it's not immutable. TameFlow is not immutable. To the contrary, it's always dynamic and evolving.
Yeah, underline that immutability. Yeah, that's very dynamic way. Yeah.
The circle for those who want to join is on circle.tameflow.com, circle.tameflow.com. And we have many things there. As we have a book club. We're reading books and commenting them and getting the authors there. We have regular events every couple of weeks. There is at least one event. We have conversation spaces, help spaces, and mind you, the conversation space is not limited to TameFlow. Why? Because I have the patterns background. I'm interested in all ideas that have provided some value somewhere. And if they are really good, they will be incorporated in TameFlow, and maybe they will kick out some other older idea. As I said, it's a place for continuous evolution, continuous improvement of TameFlow itself.
Yeah, that's the beauty of TameFlow, that openness and curious to learn the patterns from different school of thoughts and apply. So because end of the day, it is not just about the frameworks or other methodologies. It's all about solving the problems, business problems, and delivering values. Of course, that's the main focus of TameFlow. Fantastic, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us. And I really great insights about TameFlow approach and how it is building the systems thinking and the unity of purpose. That's really a crux of conversation.
Thank you so much. Anna, it's been a great pleasure. You had great questions. And as I'd always say in conclusion, goodbye, friends of Herbie.
Goodbye, Steve. Thank you. In this episode, Steve shared great insights about 4 flows of TameFlow approach and how pattern language is helpful to build shared mental models. Helping everyone to feel confident and important is vital for psychological safety. Dare to think about yourself. Make sure you are open to considering the needs of all others, because if we consider the needs of everyone, then we can find that unity of purpose. Never leave anyone like Herbie alone in the woods. Give them a sense of belongingness and help them to realize that they are the system, and systems thinking is a practical way to cause this unity of purpose.